Alright, so in this video, I'm going to walk you through first a little bit of the history of Black urban space on film and kind of the precedent for how we got to a film like Boyz n the Hood. And then I want to walk through a couple of key things about the filmmaker and the film itself. So one of the kind of key ways that the policies and political discourses on the streets that we've already kind of studied so far this semester have been kind of made solidified in the wider American imaginary was through film and television, right? And this shouldn't be surprising given what we discussed in the cinema keyword and the role of visual culture in solidifying what people often perceive to be the truth, right? So as, America's geography became increasingly segregated and racialized, television and film filled the chasm between black and white, often in determining how black urbanites were seen and understood by their white suburban counterparts. Some scholars have argued that kind of into this void, contemporary television, film, and popular culture entered, and it created some of the most kind of poignantly sordid fantasies of inner city degeneracy and moral decrepitude. And that these representations of urban life would serve as kind of markers of the distance between the suburban white dweller and the urban black dweller, right? In many ways, film and television and the way that black space was imagined on film and television kind of solidified a sense of morality and peace on the part of white suburbanites, that they had distanced themselves from both the people, the space, and that behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about the early ways in which black urban space showed up on film, and a prime example of that are the blaxploitation films of the 1970s. Many people have argued that this is a prime example of the, quote-unquote sordid fantasies of the streets, right? Blaxploitation films were in some respects a step forward, though, for black representation. The films feature black leads in urban spaces. They also capitalize on perceptions of urban blackness through the image of black fashion and natural hairstyles, as well as an emphasis on black vernacular and popular music. Films such as Sweetback's Badass Song, which came out in 1971, Shaft, that came out the same year, and Foxy Brown, which came out in 1974, and you can see some of the images from these films, featured a lone black hero fighting the man, often by drawing on Marxist and/or black nationalist politics. In fact, Huey Newton, who you should know from the Black Panthers, called Sweetback's Badass Song the first truly revolutionary black film made. In terms of cinematography, blaxploitation films utilize handheld cameras, local shooting, and synchronized sound to create a gritty sense of black urban realism. Yet, despite the fact that these films featured black actors who were actively fighting white supremacy, they also often relied on a caricature of black radicalism that undermine their political groundings. They also reaffirm stereotypes of black men as pimps, black women as prostitutes, and urban space as rife with crime, poverty, and drugs. Furthermore, these films were almost exclusively created and produced by white Americans. The way black radicalism and urban space were used by these filmmakers to increase their profits is what led Junius Griffin, who was at that time the head of the Los Angeles NAACP office, to coin the term blaxploitation. So in his mind, even though these films were having kind of black protagonists and they were fighting the man, they were really just a caricature of the realities of black activism and politics used to further increase the profits of white people in power. And so that's why he called them blaxploitation films, right? So even so, again, looking at the complexity of these films, they were a step forward in ways, but again, we can critique them in others. They did lay the groundwork, though, for the later kind of hood genre films. So in contrast to the often one-dimensional depictions of the streets in blaxploitation films, films produced by black directors in the 1980s and 1990s portrayed urban black identity and experience in more nuanced ways. In the mid-1980s, for instance, Spike Lee emerged as one of the few filmmakers to create works about black urban protagonists for mainstream audiences. Two of his most well-known movies from this time, that's my dog, sorry, are She's Gotta Have It, which came out in 1986, and Do the Right Thing, which came out in 1989. Well, She's Gotta Have It is largely a film about women's sexual liberation, and if you've seen, there's a kind of remake out there on Netflix. It still had kind of early archetypes of the kind of b-boy, as they're called, in Mars Blackman. So it began to lay the groundwork for representations of urban black youth, right? And particularly urban black male youth, right? But Do the Right Thing, more than anything else, is a clear setup for the hood genre films because it focuses on, the realities of black urban life in a city like New York, issues of racism and police violence, and how the young black protagonist navigates those. Just a few, and I will say, if you haven't seen Do the Right Thing or some of these other films that I'm going to mention throughout this video, and you're interested in using something like this for your final project, I'd encourage it. There's a lot of films out there that we just haven't had the time or the ability to watch, but that would make a good kind of thing to analyze. So Do the Right Thing is definitely one of those. Just a few years after Do the Right Thing was released, several other urban-centric films came out, and this was really the beginning of the hood genre film boom. S. Craig Watkins, who's a scholar that kind of studies this, he suggests that the boom that we saw of like wide consumer acceptance and consumption of these movies was due to a couple things. One is what we've studied, right? The rise of what he calls the post-industrial ghetto, but what we call the streets as a product of geographic segregation and public policy, right? But he also says that it has to do with the emergence of a new marketplace that was really centered on youth and popular culture, where marketing companies and businesses focus their energy on youth and popular culture. And then the third aspect, he says, is the commercialization of hip hop. And I'll circle back to that a little bit later. But hip hop is really the counterpart to these films in many, many, many ways. So these social factors make it easy to assume that, the hood genre films are nothing more than kind of a reincarnation of early black exploitation films, which is true to some extent. But a number of things distinguish hood genre films from their 1970s predecessors. First, they're often written and directed by black Americans, which is huge, right? Unlike, the reason they were called blaxploitation is because they were written and produced by white Americans, even though they have black people on screen, where these are films by and for black people, right? Second, where in the 1970s films focus on a lone black hero who challenges the cultural norms of the hood, these films really focus on communal dynamics and collective belonging. And then lastly, hood genre films typically feature urban youth as opposed to kind of an older adult figure that we saw in blaxploitation films. And so in this way, they're, like I said, a visual counterpart to hip hop, right? They challenge the way black urban youth in particular were stereotyped, and some of the ways we talked about earlier with the narratives of being super predators, et cetera, et cetera. Because hood genre films revolve around young black identity, they tend to follow the pattern of a lot of coming of age tales, right? So, you've seen all these movies where you have the young teenager trying to figure out who they are in their life and make a big decision. That's kind of the coming of age tale, right? But unlike other coming of age stories, knowledge of the streets is a fundamental component of how these protagonists grow and survive. And beyond that, the streets really shape all of their actions and behaviors in the films. Not just them, but the characters they interact with, right? Sometimes this is to a stereotypical extent, right? But it's important that not only are these films set in major cities like New York or Los Angeles, but that they really characterize, the streets themselves and the role they play in black life. They also, unfortunately include certain stereotypical figures like, the drug dealer, the gangbanger, the welfare queen, some of the stereotypes we've already talked about. But they, we'll talk about the critiques of those. But they try to balance this with some sense of kind of, or maybe in their minds, this is contributing to a sense of urban realism. And part of that is through certain film techniques, right? So synchronized sound recording, handheld cameras, grainy film stock, some of which were used before with blaxploitation, but some of which are new, were kind of used to create a greater sense of authenticity and realism to what's being shown on screen. The films also include a lot of dialogue in the black vernacular, as well as hip-hop specific clothing, music, slang. And then, I told you I'd circle back to this, many of these movies have rappers that star in them and also contribute to the soundtrack. So Boyz n the Hood, for instance, is has Ice Cube, who stars in it and makes music for it, right? If you've seen Juice or Poetic Justice, other films that I'd encourage you to check out, Tupac is in those, and again, contributes to the music and is, a star in the films. So it's interesting to think about the different ways that genres are working together and how all of this is trying to paint a picture of like an urban or authentic, vision of Black urban space, right? So all of this question of authenticity and urban realism frames these films as, on one hand, kind of a form of self-expression for Black urban youth. And that's, really some of the intention on the part of a lot of these filmmakers and even the people who star in them. But Michael Boyce Gillespie, who you read for that cinema keyword, he, again, makes kind of this critique of what happens when we only focus on questions of representation or authenticity. And so he makes an argument that, blaxploitation and hood genre films can't be viewed as like a singular entity, right? And that they can't just be judged on the merit of whether or not they're authentic representations. He argues that rather than being a matter of measuring representation, or kind of, being a fantasy of what it looks like so people can really see what it's like to be and experience Blackness, right? That the films, need to be imaginative, that they need to be about art and expression. And these films are. It's just really about how we're interpreting and understanding them, right? On one hand, arguably they're not mutually exclusive, right? So the intention set by Black creators to authentically represent their realities isn't exclusive from the freedom to imagine and depict Blackness in new ways. And that's something we'll talk about, a little bit here, and then when we get to Moonlight as well next week. But I will say Gillespie's criticism points to the way that Black film and hood genre films in particular, can be interpreted by the wider public, particularly white consumers, as a confirmation of stereotypes and one-dimensional Black identity. Because if they're created by and for Black people, with the idea of, genuine, authentic experience and representation, but yet consumed by people outside of those contexts without that knowledge, they could easily be understood as kind of a reaffirmation of certain stereotypes. So it's interesting to think about how the lens of who's seeing it and how they're interpreting it changes the impact of these films. Some cultural critics see the themes in these films as nothing more than kind of, like I mentioned with Craig Watkins, a racialized manifestation of the middle class's obsession with, seeing sensational stories on screen about urban sex, drugs, and violence, right? Watkins, and I put this quote from him, says that, what we see here and the popularity of these films, and Hollywood taking up and making more and more of these hood genre films, was really, in his words, symptomatic of a broader shift in post-civil rights era racial discourse. The fantastic and wildly distorted notion that poor Black youth constitute the core of America's social, economic, and moral crisis. So in his mind, it's acknowledging that, yes, while these Black filmmakers were using the medium as a way to, the mode of self-fashioning and defining and representing themselves, we have to acknowledge that Hollywood studios and white moviegoers often perceive the genre as an affirmation of all the kind of fantasies that they had about the dangers and the vices of Black urbanness. So it's kind of worth thinking about what is the role of these films, or how they operated through the lens of like white consumers, right? So one kind of prime example of how this worked is in a subset of these films that Robert C. Bowman calls the urban high school genre. And you probably heard of ones like Dangerous Minds, the soundtrack probably, or Lean on Me, which I have pictured here. And so in these films, what you have is usually a middle-class teacher outsider who comes into a dysfunctional inner-city school and finds himself in front of, kind of these caricatures of one-dimensional, impoverished students. And by instilling a sense of personal responsibility and hard work, the teacher outsider manages to save the students from their troubles, right? More often than not, it was a white outsider, but not always, right? Which is important to acknowledge. Either way, it's some outsider coming in with the idea that redemption comes through the form of these kids taking personal responsibility. right? And on one hand, there's some truth in that, and it's a warm, satisfying story of redemption, right? On the other hand, like a lot of scholars have pointed out, it really reinforces that kind of middle class sensibility that, this is a society based on meritocracy, meaning if you work hard enough, you get what you deserve, and individualism, which Anne Petrie, the poets we read, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and these filmmakers all critique that by showing it's not just about personal responsibility, but it's about kind of communal activity and response to these larger complex social systems, right, that create the barriers that students and people living in these spaces face, right? So these are kind of examples. In particular, this subgenre shows how some of these hood genre films and the streets, by proxy, were interpreted or consumed through the lens of kind of middle class desire and sensibility, to just see the streets as like, yes, it's horrible, it's filled with sex and crime and poverty, but it's really just personal responsibility is why it hasn't changed. Black filmmakers did challenge that, in some of the ways that they write and envision the streets as a social force, though. Overall, I will say that, hood genre films were about filmmakers asserting their own vision of the streets and challenging the way they existed in the broader white imaginary, right? But of course, they couldn't control the way these films were ultimately consumed and interpreted by the public. Regardless, they were powerful counter-narratives. So films like Boyz n the Hood, Straight Outta Brooklyn, New Jack City, Juice, Menace to Society, all focus out on how young black men protagonists navigate the streets and the threats of poverty and gang violence through familial or communal relationships, right? So they don't emphasize individualism, they emphasize community as a response. And by framing the hood itself as a repressive space that the protagonists have to fight against, the films offer a cultural critique of individualism by suggesting that the real kind of threats are these larger forces and the policies responsible for them. So ultimately, it suggests that the difference between poor black urbanites and white middle-class suburbanites is not a matter of work ethic or predisposition or morality, but rather spatial belonging and sociocultural predetermination. So I'm going to turn now to the film itself and tell you a little bit about who created it, and I want to walk through a couple of key scenes and then and then we'll wrap up. So Boyz n the Hood was written and directed by John Singleton, and it's really kind of the quintessential Hollywood hood genre. So it stars Cuba Gooding Jr., Ice Cube, Morris Chestnut, Lawrence Fishburne, all very young. And like many hood genre films, it's kind of a coming age tale, right? About Trey Styles, who's portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr., who moves in with his father after having trouble at school. And his father, Furious Styles, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, is a veteran and a small business owner, and he spends the majority of the film teaching his son, how to quote-unquote be a man and survive the threats that he faces as a young black man living in South Central LA. The film was inspired in part by Singleton's own childhood because he grew up in South Central LA, and that's Singleton on the left there. It's important to recognize that he is a director, but he was a contemporary of Cuba Gooding Jr., Morris Chestnut, Ice Cube. He just passed away, I think it was last year, and you probably saw on social media a lot of these folks posting about him because, he grew up alongside and gave a visual representation to the music and the lives and the culture that these other people were similarly giving expression to, right? So John Singleton was really important when we talk about kind of the history of black film and particularly depictions of the streets and black urban space. So he grew up in South Central LA, and then he got into USC and he graduated with a degree in film. And if you know anything about their film program, it's very prestigious. And so what he did is he took his life experiences and he wrote and directed Boyz n the Hood and released it just a year after he graduated from college. So again, he was very young when he was doing this. He became the youngest person and the first African American to be nominated for Best Director for the Academy Awards. Despite all the success, Singleton was real about his criticism of America and U.S. society and what it does to people like him, right? So I have a quote here from him that I think phrases it all, where he says, You're told to believe in the system, a system that was not created to serve you and your own. Sometimes you believe in the dream, other times you catch reality. And I love that quote because it echoes what we heard from Ta-Nehisi Coates. It echoes what we've seen from the poets we looked at a couple weeks ago, or from Ann Petrie. This idea that, yes, we see the American dream and that narrative that it's for everybody, but we know the reality and the constraints of our lives as Black people in these racialized, segregated spaces, and that the streets are what we've inherited, while the dream is what white people have inherited. It's not that Singleton didn't believe that you could pursue something good or hopeful in life, but that's not the same thing as this kind of false narrative of the American dream, that it's something different, right? And so it's interesting that he, that critique and coming to terms with reality is something that he really captures in Boyz n the Hood. So I want to talk about a few things in the film. First thing being, while the film does reflect a lot of that urban realism, there are moments where you can tell, again, it's written by and for urban Black youth. And in some ways, because Singleton's trying to convey a message to other young Black people, there's kind of, it feels like a public service announcement. And maybe you didn't grow up with some of these things in the 80s, but, they had like the after school special moment, and there'd be a scene, and then you have a message on the screen of these public service announcements. Some of that is what this film feels like, and maybe you noticed it in watching it, right? So, part of it is like there's the sentimental music, the touching father and son scenes, the one-dimensional kind of portrayals of the gang members and the drug dealers. But there's also kind of the way the film itself is framed. And so I want to talk about a couple of key scenes. First one being the opening scene. So when the movie opens, you'll notice, first thing is you get a black screen, and what you're introduced to is not a sight but a sound, right? You hear the screeching tires, the gunshots, and the men arguing, all of which signal drive-by shooting. And shortly after this kind of auditory opening, the screen title appears and the camera zooms in. And then the next image is this typewritten sentence that one out of every 21 Black men will be murdered, most at the hands of another Black man. As that fact appears on screen, then you hear the audio of a 911 call playing in the background, and this young boy cries out, "They shot my brother," right? So it's a very dramatic opening, and it's meant to set up the film's themes of inner city violence and Black on Black crime. And that's kind of a through line throughout the film. And sorry, spoilers a little bit, but at the end of the film, the audience learns that Doughboy, who's played by Ice Cube, was murdered 2 weeks after kind of the last scene we saw him in, right? After giving that notification, then the screen shows the black screen with the title screen shows up again. This time, though, next to it, you have the words "increase the peace." So if you look at the opening scene and the drive-by shooting sound and the kind of, warning about inner city violence, and then the end message, which is the same, title page now saying "increase the peace," you really see kind of a bookend that this film is Singleton's kind of letter to Black urban youth and his kind of urging of, dealing with internal communal issues like violence, right? There's other cues throughout the film that reinforce, certain things like that, but I think that's one of the primary things you notice in this being a film that is, at least from the perspective of the creator, directed towards urban Black youth and trying to send a certain message. I want to talk a little bit about, and this is something that when you read the Paula the Massoud article, she'll dig into that more, but another instance of how the film really tries to capture the reality of the streets as a confining space is through different images that we see that just pop up. So in the very beginning, for example, you see that stop sign with the plane flying overhead, and it's juxtaposing two very different symbols here. The stop sign being you're confined physically on the ground to your life in South Central LA as a Black person, and then the plane representing some of the wealth and freedom typically associated with the rest of Los Angeles, right? This is something that in the article you read, she'll dig into, LA being the ultimate city that shows kind of the utopian side of what people envision with Hollywood and things like that, and the hidden kind of reality of Black urban life in a space like South Central LA. There's other kind of images that reinforce that throughout as well, like the Reagan Bush poster with bullet holes in it, right? Tying again kind of public policy with the reality of violence in the streets. Singleton has signs like there's the police tape that says do not enter, there's one-way signs. Hopefully you noticed some of these images and the way that visually he's trying to, again, depict the streets themselves as a space of confinement and limitation. It's not individual moral deficiency, it's the streets themselves, which I think is a really unique and interesting thing that he does visually throughout the film. So that's maybe one of the more subtle ways that he communicates a message to his audience. But there's some other instances, again, where he's trying to deal with the limitations of the streets, but it goes back to those more kind of obvious PSA kind of moments, right? So one example being at the party when Doughboy's released from prison and him and his friends are playing dominoes, right? If you remember that scene. And as you notice, I'm not showing the scenes, mostly because of copyright. So because I have to put this on YouTube, if I put the clips and embed them from a film like this, the video will likely get pulled down. So I'm just showing you some images here, but bear with me. I'm not going to go super long on these scenes, but I want to make sure you notice a few key things. So in that instance where they're playing dominoes, right, they're talking about their sex lives, but it, moves into kind of this PSA about AIDS, where Doughboy starts to tell his friends who are confused, like, oh, there's you can get the disease in a number of ways. And on one hand, it's Ice Cube, and he's, talking in the Black vernacular. I'm trying to make it very casual. But it still, very much seems like a message to Black youth in a very kind of public service announcement of like, let me make sure you get this information about this thing. And on one hand, it can seem kind of cliche or cheesy, and I think that's a fair critique from our perspective. But on the other hand, remember the timing of this as 1991 and the limited information out there, and this being one of the few times you have something created by and for Black urban youth. And Singleton trying to use this medium in that way. But it's interesting to think kind of the way the film itself moves in and out of, a story about coming of age, a conversation between, Singleton and other Black youth, and a number of different kind of things that it's doing all at once. And this image I have right here in the top right corner is another example of maybe, in my mind, a very less subtle message, is when they have Cheryl, who's the crack addict appear, right, who literally is letting her child run around wild in the streets, right? So the viewer is introduced to Cheryl after Trey finds the baby, if you remember this, in the road and stops her from being run over by a car. It's very dramatic. And he knocks on Cheryl's door, and she just nonchalantly takes the baby from him, right? And then she just asks desperately if he has any drugs and offers sexual favors in exchange. You see her hair, her disheveled appearance, and, in the film she's characterized as like not having any sort of maternal instinct or concern. And yes, again, this could have some grounding in reality, but this is one of those moments where it's a very stereotypical interaction. And in this instance, at the cost of Black women, right? It's a very negative depiction, which I'll circle back to that. But it seems almost like, anti-drug skit inserted within this other broader narrative. So there are moments like that in the film that you might notice where, again, it moves in and out of a story about an individual youth to these communal messages of like what we need to know and how we need to change. Less maybe obvious in this, one thing that's I think very interesting and in my opinion really well done is the way that that the film relies, in a much more subtle way on sound to convey a specific sense of Black urban space. So if you notice throughout the film, you can hear the sound of police helicopters almost like entirely throughout the film, right? So even in that kind of very cliche moment that, there's those conventional tropes of coming of age where Trey is a young man, he convinces his girlfriend they're going to have sex, and they have this moment as youth, right? That happens in a lot of coming age movies. It's a very kind of universal experience, but the sound of the helicopters while that scene is going on and the helicopter lights as well adds a specificity of, Black urban existence layered on top of this kind of everyday, universal experience of coming of age. And so that's an interesting way that the film kind of, takes something that's universal coming of age and frames it within the particularity of the streets. If you look at this image down here on the bottom left, I want to bring your attention to the fact that, and what I just talked about with the sound, what we talked about with the images, there's all these kind of aesthetic ways that the film really focuses on Black life in the streets in general, and coming of age. But you probably notice that it's highly concerned in particular with Black masculinity, right? So, there's a scene in which Lauren Fishburne's character discusses gentrification, if you remember that scene, and he's giving insight into how, we might interpret the film's central argument about Black masculinity. So, in that scene, I should say, gives that kind of insight. So from the beginning, the film really suggests that a strong Black father is the key to stemming urban crime and violence. And you see this because it's, set from the very beginning. When Trey's having trouble in school, his mother, who is well educated and, capable, decides that what's going to save him is sending him to go live with his father, right? So Furious takes on this responsibility, he embraces it, and he spends the rest of the film teaching his son how to be a man so he doesn't end up like Doughboy. And you see how Doughboy, who's played by Ice Cube, their outcomes are kind of paralleled here because Cuba Gooding Jr.'s character Trey has his father to teach him to be a man, where Doughboy doesn't have his father. He has an overbearing mother, which we'll get to. But because of that, because of that lack of of strong Black masculinity, Doughboy's life doesn't turn out while Trey's does. So it's interesting to think, again, maybe kind of both the good and bad of that, right? We know from context in other lectures the specific ways in which Black masculinity was targeted as, an identity that really represented the vices of Black urban space. But on the other hand, we also, know that it's not just Black men living in those spaces, and that Black people of all different genders and classes and experience were having to navigate life in the streets. So it's, it's both important, but also we can critique it, going back to Gillespie, to say there's good, but there's also critique. The critique piece really comes in with the way that a lot of the Black women are kind of represented. So part of this is, with Doughboy's mother, who's the very overbearing woman, with Cheryl, the crackhead up here, with the way that they talk about all the other women as, hoochies and hoes and things like that. Remember that this really goes back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's idea. Remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. He made this argument that the reason Black people were poor and struggled in the city was because of slavery, that they didn't have men in their families, and that the Black women had developed to be overbearing. Well, that is a very racist narrative, and unfortunately, some of this, in the attempt to give a counter narrative of Black masculinity, it ends up reaffirming some of this idea that, Black women, when they're overbearing, are a problem, or, all these other kind of negative depictions. We really only have two positive Black female characters, and that's Trey's mother, who we don't see very often, and Nia Long, who plays Trey's girlfriend, and really her role is just to be, the girl he likes and the girl he gets with. But like I said, most of the women are crackheads, overbearing, abusive, or, poochies and hoes, right? So again, thinking about both the step forward and what this film does for representing the streets, right? For speaking to and from the perspective of Black youth, and for, challenging kind of dominant white narratives, but also some of the critique and kind of reaffirming certain stereotypes, particularly around Black womanhood. I will say above this, though, despite its shortcomings, Boyz n the Hood is groundbreaking in a number of ways, right? So one, it challenges the conventional images of Black youth, right, by simultaneously depicting the threats of the streets and challenging the idea that these threats unilaterally produce violent gangbangers, right? We see a variety of people come out of the same space, right? Moreover, the film humanizes characters like Doughboy, right? So even Doughboy, who is the gangbanger, is humanized. It offers a nuanced view of people who are often just, labeled as pieces of the violence of the streets and not really given their own human story. And that's important, especially right now when we consider the debates and narratives we're having about police violence. And, people are making the argument that, like, whether you are armed, whether you are angry, whatever you're doing, you deserve to have a right to life and be humanized, right? You deserve the same right to due process as anyone else, and you shouldn't have your life cut short simply because you're black, right? That has nothing to do, like, the two have nothing to do with each other, right? And so by humanizing Doughboy, it says it's even challenging the idea that you could just throw away and dehumanize the gangbanger, right? The last thing I'll point out is that by making black urban Americans the target audience, Singleton really devoted a much needed attention to them. Again, these were set forward because it's the first time that you had films made by and for black urban youth and black urban people, right? And I think in a lot of ways, Ice Cube's character, Doughboy, again, who is the gangbanger, but who throughout the film is shown to be intelligent, receptive, socially aware, he represents the intended audience, at least from Singleton's perspective, right? The person that he's in conversation with, talking about, black masculinity and options and futures and how to navigate the streets and how to watch out for threats like AIDS and drugs and things like that. So when you're looking at the film, make your critiques, embrace what Gillespie says to think about the nuance of film blackness. But also, look at the ways in which this opened the door to allow black artists to express the nature and the reality of the streets in new and, in my opinion, really exciting ways.